All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 2008, technology consultant Mike Connell died in a plane crash when his Piper Super Cub he was flying crashed 3 miles short of the runway at Ohio's Akron-Canton Airport. It's a tragic accident, a small plane crash, but this incident set off all sorts of rumors, at least within certain particular circles, especially on the internet, because Mike Connell had a firm that created websites and did other work for George W. Bush and John McCain, among other leading Republicans, and had done technology work for the GOP heading back into the early 2000s. And specifically, he had worked on voting systems in Ohio in 2004, where there were all sorts of theories and rumors about shady voting tabulation. There were also rumors in 2008 that Connell was set to testify about some of his vote tabulation work just before he died. There were even rumors that he'd been particularly cautious about the small planes that he flew in the months before his death. There were lots of rumors. So here to talk about the story of Mike McConnell, but really in a larger sense to talk about some conspiracy theories and also real questions about the 2004 election and a bit of a survey of conspiracy theories from the left, conspiracy theories from the right, and how that has evolved over the last decade and a half or so since this story. Here to do all of that in, not that long of an episode are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
That's, by the way, I'm just realizing in real time, that's the trick to not going too far down the conspiracy rabbit hole, is to force yourself to just be doing 15-minute episodes. There's only so deep we can go in 15, 20 minutes. So, yes.
I can get us there, Jody.
Okay. I have
the other side of the looking glass by the time the clock runs out.
Wonderful. So I guess we start with Mike Connell. He is a technology consultant, as I mentioned in the intro. What is his political connection, and what are the circumstances around his death that then start all these conspiracy theories that have come across our radar?
So he had been part of the kind of brain trust around George W. Bush that includes people like Karl Rove. He had been a web consultant on Jeb Bush's 1998 run for governor in Florida. And as you can probably imagine, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there are a lot of opportunities for people in political technology. And he is somebody who's brought on board and is regularly consulting the RNC, GOP committees, and advising them on the kind of information technology that's being used around elections, particularly around how to manage vote tabulation. And this is important with the Bushes because there is going to be a big revamping of voting systems after the 2000 election, especially in Florida, when Jeb Bush was governor of Florida and George Bush was elected president.
Yeah, I remember that election a lot because 2000 was so fraught. And so coming into the 2004 election, I think people are also somewhat on high alert that we could have a repeat, that fraudulence is sort of circulating, and people are not necessarily sure how it's going to happen, but there's always sort of a question of like how these tabulation machines work and how Bush can somehow get victories in places where maybe they weren't necessarily expecting one.
And in 2004, the election comes down to Ohio. It's still a fairly close race, particularly in the Electoral College. And Ohio is a state that is not only very close, but has put into place a lot of, you can call them reforms or changes to the voting system. It has a very visible Secretary of State in Ken Blackwell, who is a conservative activist. And so when Ohio goes for George W. Bush, there are a lot of people, all eyes are on Ohio, and these conspiracy theories emerge almost immediately. And there are lawsuits that are filed, and Connell is called as a witness in one of these lawsuits. He's called to testify. And on his way to give his testimony, his plane crashes and he dies. And if you have been thinking that Connell is your key witness as this IT guru and he dies on the way to the trial, you're going to have some feelings and some thoughts.
And, we're going to spend a lot of this episode sort of, I think, caveating and saying like, and moreover, I think, just like exploring the blurry line between conspiracy theory and just like stuff is playing out for a reason, or there's just naturally questions. So like around a plane crash, there are naturally going to be questions. I think it's probably should be clear that like this, by all accounts, seems like a just small planes crash and people die in them sometimes, and that's what happens.
I mean, there's a lot of pilot error in there that makes sense. Like if you're flying in bad weather, if you don't have de-icers, right, if you are, not taking heed to certain warnings, you are going to crash. Like that's not necessarily sabotage. There's a lot that can go wrong in the air. And so, the idea that someone sort of like destroyed his plane or was out to get him, that was sort of put out there, I think, before this happened. There were rumors that like, oh, he's had to cancel previous flights because, something was wrong with his plane or something like that. But you can see how those things get fed. But at the end of the day, the plane crashed not because it was sabotaged.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me, the 2004 election happens and then McConnell's going to go and testify. And that's in 2008, right? Which is this moment we're talking about here. And so I just want to kind of highlight the like, it's 4 years later, but these rumors, these questions are still persistent. And I think that's just an interesting reminder that like these rumors were still floating around, at least in certain pockets of the internet, which our blessed producer Jacob Feldman found himself in over the last 2 days putting together this episode. But I don't know what you make of that like there clearly was a persistence to some of these rumors, and some rumors some rumors and conspiracy theories come and go, and some persist for 4 years and longer.
And I think part of that is this small percentage of votes, this 3% number of votes in which Bush wins Ohio by about 118,000 votes. But there was this flip suddenly in which 3% of the votes that were alleged to go to John Kerry all of a sudden are now going to George Bush without very much explanation. And it happens around like, midnight, almost 1 a.m. And so people start to call foul. Like, how is it that he had these 3 percentage points and now he's lost these same 3 percentage points? And so people started to investigate in that moment because it seemed like, every percentage counts, of course. And so going back into the Bush corner pushed a lot of people to think that there's something else that's drawing this advantage.
And a lot of this doesn't actually have to do with the actual vote counts and tabulations and tallies, but with reporting, how people are getting the information. And so if they're getting like 2% of the vote in one precinct, but then they count it as 100% counted because that's just how the system works, it becomes very confusing, as does this idea that Kerry is ahead and now Bush is ahead. All of it has to do with the order in which the votes are counted, not in the ways that they're cast, not with manipulations that are happening behind the scene. But if you have all of this information coming at you and it's not being explained very clearly, and there are some flaws in the reporting, as we've talked about several times on this podcast, like voting is taken care of at the state and the precinct level, and it can be kind of messy. And in that messiness, these kinds of conspiracies can pretty easily be born.
Especially when there's also this element of new technology, right? It just seems like so many of the times on this show when we've talked about moral panics or conspiracy theories, a lot of it is just refracted through new, sometimes inscrutable technology. And this is clearly a part of it here. And I think it continues to be a part of, a lot of the conspiracy theories around most recent elections. And, this idea that both, as you were saying, Niki, the reporting happens in this sort of inscrutable way, but then also there's new technology. And, but at the end of the day, to me, it's like, this is how a conspiratorial mindset works, right? But it's like, what mindset are you bringing to the understanding of this information, as imperfect as it is? And so I think it was really important that the two of you both started sort of talking about how the seeds of this were planted in 2000, right? Because you see, the 2000 election was so fraught. The 2000 election, there was an intervention by the Supreme Court. It just planted the seeds for a mindset going into 2004 among liberals to then look at stories like this and moments like this and have both a justified but also conspiratorial skepticism to some of these stories as they emerge. But, I will also say, like, in defense of just kind of like some of this stuff is just the way that life works, and it's messy and weird and there's coincidences and all that stuff. I mean, I just look at like this Connell character and, the conspiratorial mindset is like, oh my gosh, Bush had this technology consultant hanging around in 2004 because of what happened in 2000. They knew that there were levers to pull, whatever, and the sort of more reasonable explanation is like, well, yeah, they saw what happened in 2000. They realized that technology is a bigger and bigger part of elections, and you need to have people who know what they're talking about. And so they brought this IT consultant on, and there's just two ways of looking at the exact same information and the exact same like title, IT consultant for the George Bush campaign in 2004, and just sort of reading it in completely different ways.
I also think it's important that this is happening in an era where voter suppression tactics are starting to ramp up as well. In Ohio, set aside the debold voting machines, set aside the new technologies, set aside the problems with the 2000 election, but there were people in more Democratic districts who were waiting online. There weren't enough voting machines. There were some real problems. And John Conyers, who is a representative from Detroit, a Democrat, holds a whole sort of commission to try to explore what went wrong in the 2004 presidential election in Ohio. He ultimately publishes that the next year. And it's more focused on those kinds of things, on voter suppression, on lack of access to the ballot, on the purging of voter rolls. But that gets mixed in with books like Did George W. Bush Steal America's 2004 Election? Or Fooled Again, How the Right Stole the 2004 Election and While They'll Steal the Next One Too. And so these legitimate concerns get mixed up with these conspiracy theories, and it becomes much more difficult to parse.
So actually, can I ask you a question about that, Niki, and Kellie as well, because this has just been a perpetual thing I think about with conspiracy theories, is obviously this like kernel of truth element, right? And there's always like it taps into something that's real and in the air, and then it gets spun out. And is it harmful to the real truth to have these conspiracies floating around, or is it that like it's in some twisted way the conspiracy theories do give oxygen to something where there is a kernel of truth floating around? And you hear it all the time sometimes from people, and I usually roll my eyes, but now I'm just kind of like, I don't know what, I'm just thinking about this in real time. But you hear people be like, well, we could have. It's like, well, this was false. Well, but sometimes people react to conspiracy theories or rumors and they're like, well, okay, that was false, but the fact that we believed it could have been true says something, right? I'm just curious what you make of that like, does it provide oxygen to stuff that we really should be talking about, or does it, distract and muddy the waters?
I think in a lot of ways it distracts. And maybe that's because I feel like, you can go down a rabbit hole. And we've seen this. We've talked about this on past episodes in which you can go down a rabbit hole with these conspiracy theories and get so far off track that it really does become difficult to like get yourself back online again. And so, in some ways, I think that when things are legitimate and they get questioned, then it becomes even more difficult to have something stand as true or stand as legitimate. And, that's sort of a part of the culture that we live in now, is that so many things have become questioned that you can't even have like a firm stance on what is legitimate or what is true.
And I think that if we were in the landscape of pure logic, that's the way that conspiracy theories could work, that we could say, okay, well, that's not falsifiable. That seems a little crazy. But why are people so anxious about that? And then we could have a conversation about that. But in a political landscape, what often ends up happening is that the conspiracy theories are used to ignore or to delegitimize the real concerns, right? Oh, this is just about debold voting machines instead of being about like the fact that people are being prevented from being able to vote.
Yeah.
And the waters get so muddied. And then when you have real conspiracy theories that instead of being promoted by a very small group of people, there are still people out there today who are 2004 election deniers or election conspiracists, that is used to sort of foment or to keep election conspiracies about the 2020 election running. So it muddies the water, and it just creates so much churn in our information environment that I think we're ultimately worse off because of it.
And you know, the way in which pointing to a conspiracy on your opponent's side lets you then dismiss all the other legitimate concerns. I mean, Niki, you know, before we started taping, I asked you kind of what you made of the story, what you make of all the sort of rumors and conspiracies on the left about the 2004 election. And your response was that you hear about it a lot on the right, and that the right brings it up pretty consistently to dismiss people. So, you know, is this a left-wing conspiracy that at this moment in 2022 mostly lives in right-wing talk?
The only place that I ever hear about the 2004 election is in right-wing circles, because it is brought up as evidence that there was nothing really that unusual about the election denialism around 2020, even though it was embraced by a president and even though it ended in a violent insurrection, that it actually is just the same as Democrats who protested the electoral vote in 2004. And it's just, you know, since John Conyers decided to investigate the 2004 election, then Mike Lindell's investigations into the 2020 election are just as legitimate. Mike Lindell, for those who aren't as steeped in this, the My Pillow guy who is continuing to fight the good fight out there.
Wow.
It is also, though, I mean, this isn't a scorecard or whatever, but it is funny that, like, it does seem like one of the things that consistently the right points to and says, well, you know, the left has conspiracy theories too. The 2004 election thing is still out there. And it's like, you want to do the math on all the right-wing conspiracies that have come on since 2004, starting from birtherism to Benghazi to the stolen, stolen elections. You know, so it's like, okay, well, if one side is got one theory and the other is just churning through conspiracy after conspiracy. And again, the big thing to look at is also, you know, what is the level of embrace by people who should know better and by so-called leaders. And I think that's clearly asymmetrical in terms of conspiracy theory among Republicans and among Democrats. But, you know, Republicans, you know, have really made a lot of hay of pointing to like Russiagate stuff and, you know, the Rachel Maddows of the world as sort of having the conspiratorial mindset and playing that, you know, it's equal on both sides game with that as well. So it is, you know, it is an effective political tool.
And we shouldn't engage in like purity politics in the sense of conspiracy theories have been part of American politics and have whirled around elections in the United States for centuries. I mean, we've talked about some of them. We've talked about real election theft in a number of different places in U.S. history. And the idea of free and fair elections in the U.S. is really a pretty recent concept. And so all of that has to be understood when we're talking about these things, that it's not new. But that we should be aware that this kind of tendency to default to ideas of rigged elections or stolen elections or something hinky going on is something that we have to constantly work to make sure that elections are transparent and accessible, and also know that these conspiracy theories are kind of the cost of doing business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I have one last question for you, Niki, just as sort of media, you know, if we can use this story as a way to understand a media dynamic, which is, how do I put this? But like, if this theory had existed on the right, which, you know, as I just said, there's plenty of examples of, you know, the equivalent on the right. I think it would have been really high profile and would have been talked about a lot and wouldn't have just been this like thing that our producer Jacob Feldman had to like go to the 9th page of Google to find, right? And so why is it that, you know, if Democrats wanted to have a conspiracy theory megaphone, why is it that they haven't been able to in the way that the right has?
First of all, I think that there are more guardrails within the Democratic Party for this, in part because it's more of a coalition and less of an ideological party. And so there are more stops along the way that keep these conspiracy theories from taking off. And the left doesn't have the same kind of media system that the right does to incubate these conspiracy theories, to spread them and to keep them at the core of the project. I mean, within a year of the 2004 election, Mother Jones, which is an important lefty magazine, came out and was just like, no, this did not happen. And it really focused on both talking about the ways that elections are not well done, and then these conspiracy theories just weren't correct, and here's why they need to be debunked. So without that same kind of media system, without that same kind of politics driving it, it just doesn't take off necessarily in the same way on the left, which is not to say that there aren't rampant conspiracy theories, which is not to say that the Democrats aren't also vulnerable to conspiracism, but it helps to have institutions and structures that elevate and keep those conspiracies going. And the right just has a much better infrastructure for that.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny in a like big sweeping sense. There's always been conspiracy theories on both sides, but I do feel like the left-wing conspiracist was like a trope and a cultural force in a way, in the 70s and 80s that really has like kind of just fallen away at this point, but like...
Well, that's because I think they get dismissed so quickly, like where on the left, it's sort of like if there's a conspiracy, people will be like, no, this doesn't have any weight to it. Yeah. But on the right, there's a conspiracy and everyone's like, maybe. Like, I feel like there's much more room for things to grow and expand than there is on the left.
Or I didn't see that tweet, right? That's the one.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, growing up, like my parents are of a generation and probably have been labeled as like lefty conspiracy theorists for a long time, and I'm just wondering, like, there isn't really that equivalent anymore.
Not
maybe,
as much.
maybe.
Not as
I mean,
strong.
I don't know. But then, of course, you can go look at like Blue Wave Twitter and be like, oh, those vibes are still out there.
It's just where it gets institutional support. I think is what matters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Hopefully, it counts a little bit as our 2004 Ohio episode. Though I bet you we could return to it and really dig into some of the stuff that went down there. But this was super interesting and a nice look at kind of the texture and landscape of conspiracy theories over the last couple generations or so. So, Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.